You know, you don't know what it'll turn into, but you just have to take it. Anyway, so I went to Russia, and very quickly realized that they had sort of a nut every month coming through and claiming that they wanted to go to space and had some scheme to get themselves into space. And the hardest thing to start off with was going to be to get the Russians to take anybody seriously. So I figured out that the best way to do that was to do the one thing that everybody hates, which is it turns out to be an essential part of the process. But no, the medical certification, and there's this whole agency which just does the medical certification for guys, you know, for cosmonaut candidates, as they call them. This is the worst fucking 2 weeks of your entire life. I had one day I went into this military hospital, and I was going in for you know, it was just like following the procedure. I just showed up where I was told to show up. Anyway, so I get led to this room, and there are all these sort of black pipes in these bottles of soapy, in these buckets of soapy water, and I get told as I'm sort of lying down on the table that today it's colonoscopy day. So a Russian military colonoscopy, not that much fun. But the kicker was the next day I get led back to the same hospital, back to the same room with the same buckets, and I get told it's endoscopy day. Same fucking black pipes. So the complicated thing about all of this was that in the transition from being a sort of Soviet state with all of these different divisions working for the government in some way, shape or form, through the collapse of that system, all of these groups were trying to keep themselves together by becoming private entities. And it really wasn't about greed or anything. They just wanted to keep doing what they did, but they had no idea how they were going to do this. And the government wasn't paying salaries. So, you know, there were a couple of thousand people in Russia at the time who were working on the space program who were not being paid. They hadn't been paid in like 18 months. So the first negotiation, you know, was really intense. We sort of sat down, there were 3 of us on our side of the table and 18 people on the other side. And each of them was representing a different group. The guys who made the rockets, the guys who made the capsules, the guys who certified the crew medically before they went into training, the guys who looked after them in space, the guys who did the training. So there's all these different groups, and they were all sort of arguing amongst each other as to what this contract should look like. It was a bit of a nightmare. And the first time we sat down, this big, fat guy stood up and started pounding the table and speaking in Russian, which I couldn't speak at the time. He was going on, and my interpreter was kind of like getting quite nervous. He was going on about how Westerners shouldn't show up and think that they could tell Russia what to do. He spoke for about 20 minutes, sat down and went straight to sleep. That was sort of what it was like, you know. There was a lot of pounding on the table, and then the guy would go to sleep, and then everybody else would sort of figure out how to get something done. Anyway, so eventually I signed a contract with the training guys and ended up in Star City, which is this little military establishment about an hour outside Moscow. And it was a fantastic, I spent 8 months there. It was a fantastic, fantastic experience. You know, this is a community that just looks, you know, just works on the space program. We had international guys coming in from Europe, from Japan, from the States, all training essentially for different missions to the space station typically. And the place is crumbling. I mean, they hadn't paid salaries, but they hadn't put anything into buildings. So literally you'd go to class, you'd be walking down this sort of very long corridor in pitch black. The floor tiles coming off, the roof has collapsed, you know, none of the lights are working. They had to leave doors open in various places just to let light in through some of the rooms. It was pretty dire, and yet the spirit of that place was amazing. You know, it was phenomenal. The instructors, the people who made it all happen, they were trying to figure out how to get from Soviet space program to something sort of futuristic. And I made a lot of friends. It was a very special time. We had all kinds of training. Some of it was physical, mostly kind of how to adapt to space. The Russians are pretty brutal about this. They put you in this spinning chair, and they basically just spin you with your eyes closed until you puke. And the thing about this is it's teaching the body, what's it? Like a school reunion. They're basically teaching you to disassociate your vestibular system, so you don't actually try to worry too much about what's up and what's down, because in space you have no sense of what's up and what's down, right? So it feels very disorienting. But if you've done this thing again and again and again, when you get there, it's amazing, you know, how you're able to sort of get on and function even though your vestibular system is just telling you things are just not right. A lot of it is like Boy Scouts, you know, we're doing survival training. The Soyuz can land pretty much anywhere. It's designed to be able to come down in an emergency pretty much anywhere. So it can land in the mountains, it can land, you know, in Kazakhstan where it's supposed to land, it can land in the ocean. So lots of different kinds of training around how to survive, you know, in Siberia in winter, or if you land in the ocean and so on. It's pretty hardcore. We ended up on a military barge in the Black Sea, and they had this whole crew whose job was basically to rock the Soyuz. So they stick the Soyuz in the ocean with you in it. And they have this diving crew that basically simulates heavy waves. Again, so that you're in this completely disoriented environment, and you've got all your drills that you've got to get through. The commute to that barge was in the lifeboats, and at the end of the first day, the first group went back to the ocean and they capsized at the dock and basically broke the lifeboat. So we were trapped on this barge for like 3 days with literally 3 loaves of bread and 2 bottles of vodka as sustenance. One of the kinds of training was the zero-G training. You know, the parabolic flights. So there's a famous airport right next to a military airport right next to Star City. And the week before I started training, one of these big Ilyushin planes that they used for this training crashed and burned with the loss of all hands. And it was still sitting there at the end of the runway, sort of throughout the training program. These planes were basically unsafe. And Star City had one of these planes, it was theirs. The one that crashed was the military one. Star City had one, it was exactly the same. Anyway, so we climb on this thing, and they dole out parachutes and give you like a brief drill. And then as soon as you got into the air, they'd take the parachutes off and put them all sort of in a pile at the end. And they say, don't worry, if there's an emergency, you can find your parachute, strap it on, and jump out. You'll be fine. Everything was kind of just slightly crazy. The European Space Agency got very worried about this, and they figured it wasn't safe for their astronauts to be flying on this plane. So they didn't want to offend the Russians by saying that the planes were unsafe, or that they had problems with the maintenance, or the pilots weren't good, or anything like that. So they said, look, they wrote to them, and they said, look, we have a policy in Europe, in the Space Agency, that all of our astronauts must fly wearing seatbelts when they fly. And of course, this is a big cargo plane. There's no seats, let alone seatbelts. So they said, we're terribly sorry, but our astronauts can't participate in this training. They can't fly in this plane. Anyway, one of the training things was this ocean survival training, and we were all a bit bemused when the European Space Agency, the astronauts, got told by the Russians, no, you have to show up at Chikalovsky Airport, because we're all flying down to the Black Sea, and we all knew that the ESA guys weren't supposed to be flying in this plane, so we were kind of confused. They were confused, and they trying to figure out what to do. Anyway, so we get to Chikalovsky for the flight down, and the Russians have driven a minibus into the cargo plane. And he said to the European guys, okay, now, you have to sit inside the minibus and put your seatbelts on. So there's kind of one love to the Russians in that little negotiation. In all the time that I was there, you know, people talk about Russia being corrupt. There was only one instance where things got unpleasant in that regard. It was actually during the sort of final preparations for liftoff. The guy who I'd been working with, who was a photographer, had chatted to some of the other photographers, and they'd said, well, the thing to do is during the launch, you want to be right close to the rocket, and about 100 meters away from the base of the rocket. There's this bunker, and if you're nice to everybody, they'll let you set up your cameras outside the bunker, and you can actually stand outside during the launch. This is sort of suicidal. If the rocket blows up, you're kind of toast. But you get the most amazing photographs. Anyway, so my photographer, this lovely guy, Pete, had set up, and he was chatting to everybody else who was doing this. And literally 2 minutes before the launch, they were closing the doors of the bunker, and the head of the Russian press, the Space Agency press corps came over and said to him, look, if he wanted to stay there, he had to promise to give him this camera, which belonged to me. Anyway, so Pete was like kind of stunned. He'd set up all of his kit out there, and he felt he had no option. So he basically said, okay, look, I don't like this at all, but fine, I'll give you the camera. Anyway, so when I got back, he told me the story. He said, you know, I'm really sorry, this is totally uncool, but I had no option. And it was the only occasion in all of the time that we were there that I thought, you know, the guys played offside. Other than that, everybody in Russia was amazing. I mean, they're crazy, they are paranoid, but they are like it.
On a nerves level, what would you like talking to Taro and Meg live on television?
That was easy because I didn't know I was live on television.
What about the woman?
It was much tougher talking to Madiba and the sick girl. She was really ill. Yeah, that was tough. Anyway, so living in Star City, in summer it's really sort of hot and sweaty, and they turn off all the cold water in the village, and to sort of descale the pipes. Anyway, so the weeks dragged on, and the cold showers are getting a bit tiresome. By about November, there was snow on the ground. I was really getting pissed off for the cold showers. Eventually, I sort of bitched to one of the Belgian astronauts who was living next door. I said, I can't stand these cold showers anymore. He said, what do you mean cold showers? It turned out that the manager had turned off the hot water just to my room accidentally. Anyway, so you go down to Kazakhstan about 5 days before the flight. You're supposed to go into quarantine, but basically you're going to this intense alcohol-fueled sort of initiation ceremony. And I think the point of max stress was really the day before launch, because up until then, everything there'd been like hurdles, there'd been milestones, there'd been gating functions essentially. There were things to achieve before you'd actually get certified to fly. But on that final day, everything was done. There was a certificate saying now we were signed off, we were certified as a crew. And it really then boiled down to fundamentally this choice. Did I actually want to fly? There's this very nice Russian guy who would be delighted to step into the right seat if I decided not to. And I was really, the first time I was really deeply stressed. I was shitting myself. Like, do I actually really want to do this? So I went for this walk through this sort of broken down quarantine facility, and I ended up sitting at the bottom of this old swimming pool that had no water in it, sitting there thinking, shit, I just need, something to shake me out of this. And my phone rang. It was a South African phone, only family and close friends had the number. And I thought, well, there we go, this is it. This is someone calling, and this is the sign. Anyway, so I answered it was a wrong number. Some guy from Mikey's Fontaine looking for Petrus. So I figured that was enough sign, I should just get up and fucking do it. A lot of people ask about the launch itself. The launch is this amazing sort of series of experiences. You get woken up really early. You get a barium enema, which I can promise you is it's not the best way to start your day. And then you go through this whole public ceremony where they suit you up in front of, like, in these sealed rooms, people with masks and sort of hairnets and white coats. They seal up your suit and they pump air in to sort of test the pressure, make sure that your suit is completely sealed, that you've tied all the knots correctly and everything. And then they formally sign you off. Then they bundle you into this car and you drive halfway to the launch pad, at which point you get out of the car, undo all of the knots and everything, take a piss on the back right tire, because Yuri Gagarin did it and it worked for him. That's also the point at which you stuff all the contraband into your suit. So basically all the smuggling that happens is done at that point. You stick, photographs, alcohol, anything that you want to take to the space station which can't be on the official register goes into your suit. But it has to be on the unofficial register. So all of the contraband the night before has been measured out and weighed. So this is kind of classic Russian. There's the official story, then there's the official unofficial story. That's part of the official unofficial story. But the launch itself is really very sort of, clinical, because a lot of the training for the G-forces and so on is in a centrifuge, which is quite radical. You're going round and round and round, so you've got a lot of fairly dynamic forces on you. But the launch is very linear. You know, the forces are straight through your chest. It's much easier than the training. And you're also very sealed off. You know, the rocket engines are 50 meters behind you. Once you break the speed of sound, which happens pretty quickly, you don't hear much. So it's this very kind of cold, careful experience, the launch. Right the way out of the atmosphere. You're sort of in the dark, essentially. There's a fairing over you. You can't see anything. Once you're out of the atmosphere, this fairing comes off, and it's this explosion of light. And suddenly you actually see the Earth outside. And you're now at about 100 kilometers up. You actually suddenly see the atmosphere and space. It's this incredible transition. But again, it stays fairly sort of clinical all the way up until you're in orbit. And your first 2 orbits, you've got a lot of work to do. You basically got to test the vehicle. You've got to get the solar panels out. You've got to check everything out, basically, make sure it's good while you're still suited up. DOS. Shit you not, actually. The Soyuz runs on DOS. And you know what? That was strangely comforting, because I think I knew all the bugs in DOS. So I was like, anyway, so life in space, going to the toilet, everything's very practical. It's like a big camping trip, basically. You've got maybe 5, 6 guys in what feels like a series of caravans, all kind of connected together. But being up there, you get this incredible sense of like experiencing humanity from a distance. You know, everything, all of our history, all of our stories, all of our experiences of life happened in this tiny little planet, in this tiny little film of atmosphere, and you only really appreciate that when you're outside of it. So it's this extraordinary feeling. There are no borders or boundaries. You don't see any of that stuff, and it really, I think, does shift one's perspective. It's like a realization. It's a feeling. Can't hear you, mate. So coming back to Earth, literally. So coming back to Earth, literally, is probably the most visceral, most physically crazy experience, because the Soyuz basically shreds into the atmosphere. It's kind of no holds barred. When you leave the atmosphere, you're only going about Mach 4. When you come back, you're hitting about Mach 25. So 25 times the speed of a bullet, 25 times the speed of sound. Speed that will, it literally melts metal. You have molten metal running over the windows. It's pretty radical. But before we came, there was a bit of a scramble to sort of get packed and leave. And we'd run out of underwear. So we're sort of packing and shit, we got to get ready, and you need this sort of special kind of underwear, but the only one that they had easily accessible was sort of used. So I'm sitting in this capsule, coming back at Mach 25, thinking, fuck this, A, this is amazing, and B, I'm in someone else's skid mark. It is absolutely crazy. The capsule basically sort of blows itself to pieces just when you hit the atmosphere in this controlled series of explosions. And then you shred into the atmosphere. You see this plasma building up around you, and this intense series of physical experiences. The Soyuz spins itself around and around to keep itself like a bullet sort of aligned. And as it punches into the atmosphere, basically most of the outside of it ablates, just burns away. So the vehicle that you end up landing in looks nothing like the thing that you took off it. I mean, it's completely destroyed essentially by this process. And you realize just the incredible magnitude of the forces involved. I mean, if something goes wrong, it's going to be very brief and messy. And that's probably the most physically challenging part of the whole experience. It's the piece that I would love to do again. I mean, it's just the most incredible ride. When the parachutes deploy, they deploy out of the side of the Soyuz. So you're traveling at about 200 meters a second in free fall, and these parachutes come out the side and kind of rip you into this incredibly dynamic, sort of shaking experience. And it's very, very humbling. Anyway, so we land in Kazakhstan, which is kind of like the Karoo without the nightlife. It's very, very flat. We land in the middle of nowhere. It's absolutely flat. And by the time we got out of the capsule, which was about 25 minutes, there was this horseman there with his daughter who was in traditional Kazakh dress. So I can't even describe the surreality of this experience. You know, you just come from space, you go through this extraordinary re-entry. Actually, we hit the ground. We ended up landing up. You bounce around a little bit. It's quite a bit of a car accident, the landing. So you bounce around a little bit. We ended up landing the right way up, you know, on our backs with the hatch above us. And what we didn't know was that there was a whole bunch of soil on the hatch. So we all opened our masks, and when they opened the hatch, we got this face full of earth. Welcome back to Earth. And when they pulled us out, there was this little girl running around.
Was she hot, sir?
What's that? Tell you what, 10 days in space.
Anything's hot!
So there's this little girl running around. It was just totally surreal. Then they put you into these helicopters and bring you back to Star City. Anyway, for a series of celebrations. Anyway, so about 2 weeks after we flew, they had this ceremony. We have a prize-giving ceremony. Anyway, the night before was basically our last night in Star City. We had this huge party, so we showed up the next morning for this prize-giving ceremony. What I didn't realize, fatal mistake, was that they had this brass band. Now, a Russian hangover with a brass band is a really bad idea. We ended up having to march around Star City with this brass band. I swear, there was a guy with a trombone right about here. Cymbals, drum, worst hangover ever. What's that, right? Now there was little opportunity for good food in Star City, I can assure you. So we ended up basically wrapping there, and in the final ceremony, we had to make little speeches. So one of the things I did was give the head of the press agency his camera, saying that I thought it was a little unusual, but I'd been told that it was a requirement from him to present him with a gift in order to be able to take photographs of the launch. Apparently he didn't become much of a photographer, but I thought it was a fitting way to pay him his price. So that was it. It was briefly fun to be famous, but I knew my 15 minutes was over at the Chelsea Flower Show about 2 weeks later when, sort of wandering around the flower show, I'd run into a couple of South Africans and they'd asked for photographs. Anyway, so then I was standing in front of the South African exhibit there, which had a whole bunch of stuff from Kirstenbosch, and this woman said, hello, do you mind if I take a photograph? So I was like, no, that's okay, and I smiled, and she said, no, just step aside. So that was about it. It was a pretty phenomenal experience, and delighted to share it. Anyway,